Time is money, a familiar saying that almost everyone has heard. However, over time, more and more people have begun to question the universal truth of this statement. They argue that time doesn't necessarily have to equal money. At least for them, it doesn't. If time really is money, why don't my late nights working overtime bring me the rewards I deserve? If value is created through labor, then why are there values that never seem to materialize? Where do they go? In fact, that value doesn't disappear. The theory still holds true. But something has changed. Although labor time is transformed into value, the surplus value is appropriated by capitalists to serve profit-making purposes. Simply put, behind the notion of equality in labor lies a silent transfer of value, from the hands of workers to the hands of capitalists. From money to capital, how does the accumulation process occur? What constitutes capital? That is the topic that Capital, Volume 2 aims to clarify. In the previous volume, we learned that commodity circulation is a necessary condition for capital formation, but it is not sufficient. Only when money is transformed into capital does the mechanism for generating surplus value in production truly begin to function. So how does this transformation take place? First, let's recall the role of money in simple circulation. At this stage, money merely acts as an intermediary in the exchange of goods. That is, to satisfy needs. But when the goal of exchange shifts from consumption to value generation, money ceases to be just a means. It becomes the end. The formula becomes MC Emprim, where M is the initial money, C is the commodity, and M is the final amount of money received. The key point is that Emprim must be greater than M. In other words, money is used to buy goods, enter into production not for consumption, but to generate more money. At the heart of this logic is value augmentation, meaning that through the process of production and circulation, money creates additional value. But the question is, where does that added value come from? After all, there must be an intermediary means. The answer is labor. Because money itself is only an intermediary, it cannot generate value on its own. To do that, money must enter the field of production, where it is used to buy labor power and means of production. Then combine the creativity of labor with the production process. Only then can it yield profit. Here, labor power is considered a special type of commodity. It not only creates use value, but can also generate value beyond itself. This unique characteristic makes labor power the foundation of capital accumulation. Now let's delve into the concept of labor and its three basic attributes, because these concepts will reappear frequently in later sections. First, the purpose of labor is to create a product with use value that meets human needs, such as producing a cup for holding water. Second, the means of labor are the tools, equipment, or conditions that workers use to produce, like a pressing machine or kiln in a cup-making workshop. It's important to note that means of labor are only a part of a broader concept, the means of production. Don't confuse these two terms. Third, the object of labor is the raw material being acted upon in the production process, such as clay or the fuel used to make the cup. Understanding these principles allows us to easily approach the concept of surplus value. Like commodities, labor power also has two attributes, value and use value. However, unlike regular commodities, labor power cannot be separated from the worker, making it unique. The value of labor power is determined by the cost required to sustain the worker's life and reproduce the next generation. In other words, expenses like food, housing, transportation, and childcare. It is also determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce those necessities. The use value of labor power lies in its ability to create new value during the production process, even exceeding its own value. This unique trait is what enables labor power to generate surplus value. In other words, when a capitalist hires a worker, what they purchase is labor power. But the value that the worker creates in one day can far exceed the wage they are paid. That excess value is surplus value, and it does not belong to the one who created it, but to the employer. Here's an easy-to-understand example. You, the reader, open a coffee shop and hire an employee. Each day, you pay this employee 200,000 VND, enough for food, transport, and basic needs. They work 8 hours a day, but within the first 4 hours, they already make and sell enough coffee to earn the shop 200,000 VND. This is the necessary labor time, the period during which labor creates value equivalent to the wages paid. In the remaining 4 hours, they continue to work, producing goods and revenue, but receive no extra pay. That value, created by their labor, is surplus value, and the beneficiary is you, the shop owner. That increase in value is essentially free for you. At this point, you might wonder, but I still have to pay for rent, materials, utilities, and so on. That's true, but there's still a broader, objective reality. We can't ignore the fact that sometimes a shop has few customers, revenue doesn't cover expenses, and competition forces closures. Clearly, these risks are not borne solely by the worker. From this perspective, does overemphasizing exploitation overlook certain objective conditions? This way of thinking unintentionally creates a divide between employer and worker, leading to limits in understanding. This is precisely what I want to highlight and analyze with you. We can see that when an example is told in the third person, listeners can stay objective. But when it's told in the first person and involves personal interest, people often rely on their own experiences, leaning toward one side and ignoring other perspectives, leading to dead-end conflicts. It's the same in life, and especially in debates. People often only see what they have, without recognizing who they are in the bigger picture. And this is what makes seeing the truth fairly and objectively one of the hardest things to do. One of the key tasks of philosophy is to seek a comprehensive, objective, and dialectical perspective, so that through the negation of the negation, we can discover a new path of development. This represents a spiral progression, aligning with the objective laws of social evolution. In the earlier example, we can clearly see that labor relations are not simply antagonistic conflicts, but rather an intertwining of interests, negotiations, and balance. This ties back to human nature. Workers create surplus value and receive a living wage in return. However, that wage is usually lower than the actual value they generate. On the other hand, capitalists face risks, a fundamental characteristic of capitalist production. But that risk cannot be used as an excuse to justify exploitation. Even though surplus value can help offset risks and generate additional profit, it does not mean the interests of workers should be entirely sacrificed. Thus, the core of this relationship lies in distribution, and distribution is deeply subjective, influenced by human will. As Marx cited Thomas's famous quote in Capital, "When profit reaches 10%, some people begin to stir. At 50%, they are willing to take risks. At 100%, they ignore the law. And at 300%, they are not even afraid of the gallows." This makes achieving a balanced distribution incredibly difficult. For example, if society leans entirely in favor of workers and does not allow businesses to earn reasonable profits, no one will want to do business anymore. This would lead to widespread store closures, job losses, an inability to maintain livelihoods, economic stagnation, rising prices, and ultimately, a societal crisis. At that point, business owners will just want to leave the country. Conversely, if the balance tips entirely toward capital, oppression, exploitation, corruption, and dehumanization will arise, turning people into mere tools. Eventually, widespread dissatisfaction will erupt, triggering societal disruption and crisis. Then, capital quietly transfers funds abroad through banks and exits the scene. The message I want to convey is this: balance is a dynamic process, always shifting like a stream, sometimes violent, sometimes calm. This process of adjustment always involves a delay, and we must never mistake temporary adjustments for the final outcome. In today's fast-paced world, I hope you can remain clear-headed, able to distinguish hollow slogans that emphasize only one side, incite emotions, or sow division. Instead, stay true to your independent value judgments. Of course, some might object, why talk so much? On one hand, you defend workers, on the other you speak for businesses, then circle back, calling for reconciliation. Have you put any money in my pocket yet? Only when cash lands in my hands does it mean anything. The rest is just fluff. I understand. In the short term, these words may not improve your life. I also understand that overcoming greed is about mastering human instinct. But I still hold on to the belief that, if more and more people truly understand the logic and nature of how society operates, there will certainly be those who have the courage and determination to drive progress. At the very least, there is already one major supermarket that has managed to do this. They have found a fair way to distribute the surplus value of labor. As I once mentioned in the Principles of the Philosophy of Right, To become fully human and to respect others as equally human, that might be the true meaning of civilized evolution. To pass on civilization through time, not let time erode civilization. That's exactly what it means. Now that we understand how surplus value is created from labor, let's delve deeper into the process of increasing that value, namely the concepts of absolute and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is created by extending working hours or increasing labor intensity, forcing workers to produce more value within the same day. Returning to the coffee shop example, if a worker spends 4 hours creating products worth 200,000 VND, their wage, then that's the fair exchange. But if the owner sees the worker not as a human but a tool and assigns nearly impossible tasks, like completing 4 hours of work in just 2 hours, then as the worker tries to fulfill the demand, they are generating more surplus value in the same time span. That's absolute surplus value. Relative surplus value, on the other hand, is generated by increasing productivity, thereby reducing the necessary labor time without extending total working hours. For instance, the owner might save money by buying cheap, low-quality coffee and using broken, unsanitized machines. As a result, the brewing process becomes twice as fast. The time needed to create value equivalent to the worker's wage decreases, and the remaining time becomes surplus labor. This means that capital, without extending working hours, succeeds in shortening necessary labor time. In other words, in the same period, the same output is achieved, freeing more time for surplus labor. From this shift in perspective, capitalism transforms from mere production into a self-expanding, self-profiting process, one driven purely by profit. Alongside this comes a significant consequence: the relentless rise of the capitalist ambition to appropriate surplus value. This results in one of two outcomes, either putting pressure on workers or deceiving consumers. In any form, its nature remains an escalating process. Even when laws are enacted to protect workers' rights, capital simply redirects, cutting costs through inferior materials, reducing labor, and any means necessary to maximize profit. However, what's crucial is to assess this entire process objectively. It's a dynamic, constantly evolving system that continually adjusts in pursuit of true fairness and equality for all. If we look deeper, we'll see that labor and value creation processes clearly reflect the contradictions inherent in capitalist production relations. First is the reification of labor, where workers lose control over their creations, which are stripped from them and turned into profit tools for capital, rather than reflections of personal value, creativity, or identity. Then comes the logic of capital, where the goal of production no longer serves human needs but mutates into an endless expansion of capital itself, a closed loop without end. Thus, production under capitalism is dual-natured. It simultaneously generates material wealth and enacts the exploitation dynamic. The worker, the main force in production, fades into the background, assimilated into a tool for increasing profit for the owning class. At this point, you might ask, if the core of value augmentation lies in surplus value, and surplus value originates from the operation of capital, can we then view capital as a unified, singular entity? The answer is no. Capital is not a homogeneous block. It exists in various roles and functions within the production structure. When we examine it more closely, we can distinguish capital into two forms: constant capital and variable capital. This is the foundation for understanding how surplus value is created. Constant capital is the portion of capital used to purchase means of production, including fixed capital like machinery and equipment, and circulating capital like raw materials, fuel, tools, and premises. During production, the value of constant capital doesn't increase. It is merely transferred into the final product. For instance, a machine worth 100 million VND, with each production cycle causing 10 million VND of depreciation, only that depreciation portion is counted in the product cost. The machine itself does not generate new value. For this reason, Marx called constant capital dead labor. It embodies past labor and serves as the material foundation for current labor. In contrast, variable capital is the portion of capital used to pay workers' wages. What's special is that variable capital not only reproduces itself, but also generates additional value, this surplus value. For example, if a capitalist pays a worker 100,000 per day, but the worker produces goods worth 300,000 VND, then 100,000 VND covers wages, and the remaining 200,000 VNs is surplus value, belonging to the capitalist. Therefore, Marx called variable capital living labor, because it alone can create new value. It is the only source for capital growth. The relationship between constant and variable capital is mutually dependent but clearly distinct. Constant capital provides the material basis for labor. Variable capital not only activates the transfer of value from constant capital but also creates new value. The difference lies in this: constant capital merely transfers existing value, while variable capital increases it. Thus, in the pursuit of profit, capitalists pay special attention to exploiting variable capital, because only from it can surplus value arise. Understanding this leads us to an important conclusion. Although both types of capital are production costs, only variable capital creates actual profit. So if a capitalist changes the ratio between constant and variable capital, how would that affect the economy's direction? This is a complex question, because explaining it through formulas or pure theory easily leads to abstract, circular reasoning. And this is one of the reasons many graduate students feel confused when studying this topic. Let's consider a practical example to better grasp the concept, then we can return to theory. Keep in mind, I am a philosophy researcher, so my interpretation of Marx's ideas leans more toward philosophical analysis than detailed economics. For those studying for exams, you should complement this with lectures from your professors. This is very important. Let's take the example of a t-shirt factory with the following capital structure. Constant capital, comprising machinery and raw materials, is worth 20 million VND. Variable capital, meaning the total wages paid to workers, is 10 million VND. Each worker works 8 hours a day, with 4 hours being necessary labor and 4 hours surplus labor. Each worker produces 10 shirts per day. The factory employs 50 workers, so total daily output is 500 shirts. Upon detailed calculation, we see total necessary labor time is 200 hours, 50 workers pints 4 hours, and surplus labor time is also 200 hours. If each hour of labor creates 50,000 VND in value, then the total surplus value is 10 million VND. The total value of the produced goods is 20 million machinery, raw materials, plus 10 million wages, plus 10 million surplus value equals 40 million VND. Thus, the net profit is 10 million VND, and the rate of profit is 1030 equals 33.3%. After completing the previous order, the capitalist hears a suggestion. New generation machinery can make one worker as productive as two. He immediately decides to adjust the capital structure, boosting investment in constant capital and reducing variable capital. Specifically, he buys more automated machinery to increase productivity and reduce dependency on human labor. Now the new capital structure looks like this. Constant capital rises significantly due to the cost of the new equipment. The lifespan of these machines is 5 years, and their value will be gradually transferred into the products over that time. Meanwhile, variable capital wages drops to 6 million VND. Labor conditions also change. Thanks to automation, each worker can now produce 20 shirts per day, even though they still work 8 hours. The total workforce shrinks to 30 workers, and total daily output rises to 600 shirts. Looking at the new profit report, we see output increases, labor decreases, wages fall, but the rate of profit does not increase. On the contrary, it drops significantly. This is a textbook example of Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Even though the capitalist invested in new machinery, thus increasing constant capital, it's important to understand that machines only transfer their own value into the product. They do not create new value. A capitalist cannot exploit machines. They cannot derive profit directly from the machines themselves. They still depend on living labor, human workers, to create surplus value. Even though productivity rises, the total capital invested rises too, but the profit rate falls. To put it simply, a capitalist can only exploit workers to appropriate surplus value. They cannot exploit machines because machines represent dead labor, fixed value. In contrast, human labor is living labor. It constantly creates new value, is dynamic, and is the true source of profit. This also partly answers a common question: can capital completely replace humans with machines? The answer is no. Even in a fully automated production line requiring no human intervention, the output of machines remains fixed. it cannot spontaneously increase. Humans, on the other hand, can create value beyond their own worth, making them an infinite source of profit. That's why capitalists often use the strategy of increasing output, thanks to machinery, to quickly dominate the market, creating the effect of selling cheap but selling in volume. Then they expand market reach and maintain high selling prices so that total large-scale sales yield significant profit, preserving their competitive edge. Eventually, when there's no other way to boost profit through scale, they return to intensifying exploitation of workers to capture even more surplus value. Now let's broaden our view to examine how this process impacts the entire economy. Remember, when machines were introduced, 20 workers were laid off. This raises the unemployment rate. The unemployed, having lost stable incomes, are forced to cut spending, purchasing only essential goods. As a result, demand for other goods sharply declines. Meanwhile, the remaining 30 workers still work 8 hours daily, but now face greater pressure operating advanced machinery. If they fail to meet productivity targets, they risk wage cuts or poor performance reviews. Over time, they become mechanical, emotionally numb, completely alienated. In such environments, a competitive mindset also arises. Everyone is drawn into a vortex of comparison, rivalry, and mistrust, what we often refer to as the fog of commodification, a state of obscured humanity caused by objectification of goods. Capital, by nature driven to maximize profits, continues to produce more and release more products to maintain market advantage. But while goods increase, the income and purchasing power of workers decrease. Products don't sell, inventory grows, and people choose saving over spending. Money flow slows, economic circulation declines, supply surpasses demand, leading eventually to a crisis of overproduction. All these factors combine to create a phenomenon even more fearsome than inflation, deflation, or worse, systemic economic stagnation. When this happens, the capitalist drive for accumulation also weakens, which further amplifies internal contradictions and pushes the economy into prolonged instability, or, more severely, into cyclical crises, those periodic downturns. It's important to note that what I present here is a reasoning process, not a comprehensive description of reality. Reality is far more complex, with many intertwined variables. However, through this logical process, we can see, when we truly broaden our perspective, we realize that all components, labor, capital, market, are intricately linked. It's a dynamic relationship, constantly interacting, with no ultimate winner. In this reflection, there are no victors. Labor is alienated. Capital loses its sustainable drive for accumulation, and the market becomes unstable. All fall into a triple losing spiral. And the root cause of this crisis, we might summarize it in one